presentation that they're getting ready to do. We did this together. This is how I met her. Oh, this is very important because our kids are getting ready to go back to school. They're going to be enticed. They're going to be stressed. They're living through trauma. They're going to want to smoke cigarettes. They're going to do vaping. And part of this coalition was the non-smoking. So I'm glad that we're doing this. And I just want to say it's very dear to me to see this come back around, to have this presented again. So thank you, ladies, for doing this.
Thank you for having us.
So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Bethlehem and Latricia. I don't know who wants to go first, however you want to do it.
Who has the slides?
I can share them on my screen, Trish.
Okay.
So I could just go first and then share your presentation after, if that's okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
So I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully I do this correctly. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, guys. Okay. Could you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, my name is Bethlehem Yahalawerk, and I will be talking about just some myths and facts about vaping today, and then Latricia will cover most of the menthol information. So let's just go ahead and get started. Okay, so here is just a quick image of just the evolution of vaping devices that we've seen. And most people think that e-cigarettes are safer because they just think that it's flavor and water, but it's really not. It's actually aerosolized nicotine, which means that instead of burning tobacco, e-cigarettes are battery-operated devices that heat and deliver a mixture of flavoring, liquid nicotine, and other chemicals to the user through an inhaled aerosol. E-cigs have been on the market since 2007 and have gone through many stages and styles, as you can see here. So the earlier e-cigarettes that were on the market were called cig-a-likes because they resembled regular combustible cigarettes. And then they later became these larger mods, which meant that the user was often, or it allowed the user to have more control over the device, to modify their experience. And now you can see that they're a lot smaller and sleeker and resemble innocuous devices like USB drives, which makes it a lot easier to hide, especially when you're talking about youth use. And we're just going to talk a little bit more about the e-liquid inside of e-cigarettes. So almost all vape liquids contain nicotine, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. But besides nicotine, e-cigarette aerosol can contain other cancer-causing chemicals, heavy metals, and ultra-fine particles that can be inhaled deeply into the lungs and harm your body. And even though e-cigarette aerosol generally contains fewer harmful chemicals than regular cigarettes, safer doesn't always necessarily mean safe. And this applies to both people using e-cigarettes as well as people who may be exposed to secondhand smoke aerosol from other people using e-cigarettes. So all of these chemicals here on this slide have been found in e-cigarette aerosol, and the ones highlighted in yellow are known to be harmful. And many of these chemicals are actually the same chemicals that you find in traditional combustible cigarettes. So e-cigs produce an aerosol, like I mentioned, that often contains glycerin, flavorings, nicotine, and many other harmful chemicals and toxins. And I'm just going to highlight propylene glycol here. So propylene glycol is one of the main ingredients in all e-liquid because it produces vapor when heated. So it's approved by the FDA to eat. So it's in a lot of food coloring, cough medicines, Cool Whip, those things. And it's also okay to put on your skin. So it's in many lotions, shaving creams, and soaps. But when it's heated and vaped, propylene glycol changes. And because heated liquid, it changes to gas. And so that heated propylene glycol becomes formaldehyde gas, which is a carcinogen. So heavy metals like nickel are also found in aerosol, the e-cigarette aerosol, and inhaling high levels of nickel is linked to chronic bronchitis and lung cancer. And if you did a chemical analysis of a new bottle of e-liquid, you probably wouldn't find any heavy metals in there. So you're probably wondering, like, how would you inhale toxic heavy metals then? And it happens when the heated e-liquid travels through the vaping device and the user inhales traces of heavy metals from the metal in the vaping device. Another chemical that I just wanted to point out was cadmium, and that's also linked to lung, kidney, and prostate cancer. So nearly all e-cigarettes and e-cigarette liquids are flavored, and to create these flavors, companies have to add multiple chemicals to get the flavors that they make. And interestingly, a 2020 study found that these chemicals can be toxic to the lungs. So when inhaled, they affect the macrophages, which help the body's immune system to track and clear away bacteria. And macrophages are like street sweepers for the lungs. They are powerful immune cells that continuously clear away inhaled bacteria and other foreign matter that enters the lungs. And this study also showed that chocolate and banana flavors in particular were the most damaging to lungs. Okay, so now I'm just going to jump into nicotine. So as we talked about, almost all vaping products contain nicotine, and nicotine's negative health effects extend to all systems of the body, which includes the brain, cardiovascular systems, your respiratory, renal, and reproductive systems. So for example, vaping is linked to higher risk of stroke, heart attack, and diseased arteries. And I just wanted to add this slide here to kind of illustrate like the level or how much nicotine is in each of these vaping devices or vaping products compared to a pack of cigarettes. So the part of the brain that's responsible for decision-making and impulse control is not fully developed during adolescence, and young people are more likely to take risks with their health and safety, including use of nicotine and other drugs. And we also know that no amount of nicotine is safe. So nicotine can really interfere with brain development, and it can have long-term effects on cognitive development and mental health. And it's also highly addictive, especially as youth, their brains are still developing. So they can become addicted to nicotine much more easily than adults. Now I'm just going to be talking about the marketing tactics that e-cigarette companies use to target youth. So the tobacco industry has been trying to find ways to attract kids to tobacco products for almost 50 years. And here are just some quotes from the industry executives that I've combined together. So this one, for example, it is important to know as much as possible about teenage smoking patterns and attitudes. Today's teenagers is tomorrow's potential regular customers. So they're always trying to find new customers, and youth are probably the easiest to attract, especially through these fun flavors and cool looking products. So this is just another example of how vaping companies are following the tobacco industry's old playbook on how to target kids. You can kind of see similarities between this more recent Juul ad and this older Newport ad where they use like young, fun, models to kind of like attract the younger population to use these products. Vape companies also have been often using celebrity influencers. So for example, in this ad here, you can see Post Malone as a celebrity influencer to get teens to vape. But just to note, social influencers selling vapes are no longer allowed on social media sites like Instagram and Facebook, so we probably won't be seeing that as often. And that is all I got for you all. I can stop sharing my screen and pull up Latricia's unless you all have questions. Oh, there you go.
I have a couple of questions and comments. One question as you were speaking, you know, I've never seen one, but what is a hookah? Because I understand that from watching TV and stuff, that there are places that have hookah bars where people, is that the same as vaping or what?
So hookah is not the same as vaping because vaping is like electronic type of device, but hookah is more of like it is tobacco. I mean, they use tobacco to smoke it. It's a pipe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the same as vaping, but I mean, it's still you're smoking
Okay.
nicotine and inhaling smoke when you're using hookah.
And then in your slides there, I just want to emphasize, to have you emphasize the point of concentration, because people thought, and we were told early on, that vaping would be a way for people to have the sensation of smoking without ingesting the same amount of nicotine or with avoiding nicotine. But your charts indicate that is totally and absolutely untrue. And from what I could read, and you can confirm if I'm reading this properly, vaping really concentrates the amount and magnifies the amount of nicotine that people are taking. Am I reading it right the way?
Right. I think it's just also the way that the nicotine is hitting you through a vape is much different than from a combustible cigarette. And you're right. I mean, there are high levels of nicotine in these products, and there are some products that advertise as like zero nicotine or like very low levels of nicotine, but it still like packs the punch when you're using it, especially as a young person. Going through like one Juul pod a day, it's like so much nicotine, such levels of nicotine being inhaled.
My last comment is that I noticed in those influencer advertisements, the third one you didn't mention, where some executives said, "We don't sell that, we just we don't use it, we just sell it." Right? Just reminded me that years ago I confronted a young person that was kind of in my circle about the mindset of that cohort using crack cocaine. And his comments were almost exactly the same. We don't use that SHI, we just sell it to you old people. And they were young people, enterprise minded, that's how they saw themselves anyway. And their enterprise that they don't use, but they were looking for customers. I call customers in this case victims, and that's a predatory mentality that I think we have to always be aware of. So I just say that as a comment and an appreciation for the analysis that you're bringing and the education that you're providing. Any other questions or comments? So Latricia, why don't we go with your presentation?
Thank you. I'm going to, well, I don't see it now. I just had my presentation up and now I've lost it. Where did it go? Just give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. I think I have it. Can you see it?
Yes.
You can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for having us here. My name is Latricia Vital. I'm the Director of Health Policy and Advocacy at North Point Health and Wellness Center. I've worked on tobacco control for about 20 years. This is sort of a reunion for me. Clarence, Al, and Diana have all lent me a hand throughout my adult career in tobacco control and has contributed to the education and prevention work that I've done in North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis in particular over the years. So I kind of got a start in doing this work because I grew up with all of my favorite people in my life being smokers, and all of them were smokers of menthol. It wasn't until I was in early teens that I realized that menthol was heavily used in Black communities and not really, like, my white friends at the time didn't even know what menthol were. So I found out that we have been targeted by big tobacco. And of course, I was infuriated when I found out that we didn't, that Black people didn't just have some propensity for mint, that we don't like necessarily love shamrock shakes or, mint gum or whatever, that we have been targeted by big tobacco for menthol use. So I'm just going to get into a little background. What is menthol? Menthol is a chemical compound extracted from peppermint or cornmeal plant or created synthetically. Menthol is present in some degree of most cigarettes. When not promoted as a characterizing flavor, menthol often is included in non-menthol tobacco use as well. So even though you're not smoking a menthol product, more than likely menthol is there to prevent the harsh taste of tobacco. And so here are some familiar products that folks see in their, stores, gas station, tobacco shops that are used. It's a flavor in cigarettes. Some brands are synonymous with menthol, like Newport. Menthol cigarettes made up 32% of the cigarette market in the US in 2011, up from 22% in 2010. Also, Nielsen data shows that Marlboro, Menthol, and Newport seem to be the most popular brands in terms of pack sold, and Camel is the third. So what are some of the harms of menthol? The big thing is tobacco is the number one killer. Tobacco is the number one cause of death and disease in the US, and menthol cigarettes account for approximately 1/3 of the cigarette market share. Also, menthol makes it harder to quit and easier to start. So menthol increases nicotine absorption, leading to greater dependence. Among high school smokers, those who smoke menthols are more likely to smoke within 1 hour of waking and more likely to report cravings compared to high school non-smokers of menthol. And so who's using menthol? Here's a chart that shows nationally, 88% of African American smokers use menthol compared to only 24% of white people. In Minnesota, 74% of African American adults smoke menthol compared to 25% of adults overall. Again, just to show, from 1952 to 2006. So initially, menthol cigarettes were used to target white women. It was more of a housewife targeted message that they put out there because the taste was supposed to be less harsh. And what the tobacco companies found out was that it wasn't catching on. So they started beefing up their efforts in places where Black people were present. And so you see that number jump from 5% in 1952 to 82%. And now in 2021, we're about 88%, close to 90%. And that's not by accident. That's through heavy targeting and messaging in the Black community. And I'm going to talk to you about how the tobacco industry has targeted. The tobacco industry targeted through there's been sufficient research to confirm that tobacco companies targeted youth, women, and African Americans with menthol marketing. Research also suggests that tobacco companies targeted Latinos, Asians, and Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. Again, another quote from R.J. Reynolds: "We don't smoke that. We just sell it. We reserve the right to smoke for the young, the poor, the Black, and the stupid." And that quote was unveiled during, some of you may know, Minnesota sued the tobacco industry and won a huge lawsuit. And that's the money that Bethlehem and I get to do our work out of. And so a lot of tobacco documents were unveiled in that lawsuit, and that's where this quote came from. And here's another one: "No one really knows how African Americans came to prefer menthol cigarettes in the first place, but relentlessly targeted marketing campaigns locked the preference in place." Targeting started in the 60s with these 5 approaches: collect data about African American consumers, use mobile marketing vans, develop special promotions for inner city tobacco retailers, engage with local organizations to improve corporate image, and then advertise in magazines. So in the 60s, that wasn't a time where Black people saw themselves in publication. So what we begin to see is the magazines of the times in the 60s and 80s, Jet magazine, Essence magazine. We started seeing these ads of people who look like us that were promoting tobacco. They were using these mobile marketing vans anywhere where they thought Black people were present. So welfare offices, check cashing places, liquor stores, nightclubs, they would go and promote the products heavily and pass out free samples and swag. The bottom line is that key African Americans engaged as consumers and silent as opponents while getting the African American leaders to speak on behalf of the tobacco industry. So back then, you would see organizations like the NAACP or the United Negro College Fund advertising for tobacco as well, because these were opportunities for funds for African American communities. We didn't have the information we have about the dangers of tobacco then. And so, a lot of, even still now, a few years ago, the Reverend Al Sharpton came here to fight against a tobacco policy we were working on. And he currently is under contract for the makers of Reynolds America. They make Newport, and he usually goes to towns with Eric Garner, the guy who was selling loose cigarettes outside of a corner store, with his mom, talking about rolling back some of the policies we want to put in place. At that time, we had a restricting the sale of flavored tobacco, including menthol tobacco, to adult tobacco shops only, or liquor stores where children can't be present. And he came to town to have a rally along with some other prominent Black leaders, saying that if those type of policies pass, Black men would be disproportionately attacked by police for cigarettes. And we know that that's not true. That is a scare tactic. And also, he's well paid by the tobacco industry to put that kind of messaging out. But that is the history of the tobacco industry. And here's just some organizations over the years who back then had ties with the tobacco industry. Some of them still do, and some of them do not. So NAACP, National Urban League, Congressional Black Caucus, National Black Chamber of Commerce, National Black Police Association, United Negro College Fund, Southern Christian Leadership Council, and National Conference of Black Mayors. And so again, those are organizations that receive funding from Big Tobacco, and I'm sure they use that money in a good way, but they still have ties to Big Tobacco. And the National Black Chamber of Commerce believes strongly that menthol is a rather inconsequential ingredient in the cigarette. Menthol simply is a taste preference preferred by African Americans, and it should not be singled out for a ban. And we all know that through studies and data that that's not true. People who smoke menthol will only smoke menthol. If you have a cigarette that's not mentholated, they will pass. They will not smoke it if it's not menthol tobacco. And then I'm just gonna go through some slides really quick. So here's an old ad from 1962. Elston Howard was an athlete. And we know now, we don't advertise athletes using tobacco. And here is this baseball player. It was an early spokesperson for Cools in the late 1950s. And, he proclaimed that it was a good thing at that time. Here's some more ads. Here's 1974 ad and the 2013 ad. Very similar, very similar. So they're doing the same things, maybe not in the publications that they were, but the advertising is similar. More 1977, 2011, similar. Another one, 1975, 2015. And then right here is a Cools ad. This is 2004. Another one, I'm just going through a series so you can see some of the older ads and the newer ones, and they're all very similar. Salem. And then what can be done to regulate menthol? I am the co-chair of the statewide menthol coalition, and it includes a diverse group of leaders. I started out by saying that, some folks on this call have helped me out in my work and have served at different times. Some people have served at different times on on the Menthol Coalition. We're a group of community organizations that are driven and committed to reducing tobacco harms on youth and adults living in Minnesota through education, advocacy, and policy change. The Menthol Coalition led the first Minnesota cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, to include menthol in their flavored tobacco restrictions in 2017, and 12 other cities have since done the same. And what we can do, cities and counties in Minnesota have the authority to regulate the sale of tobacco products, including menthol. Minneapolis and St. Paul were the first cities to include menthol in their flavored tobacco restrictions in 2017, and 16 other cities have done the same. And we continue to work at the city level, and it drives our statewide work. And if menthol were banned, of Minnesota adults who smoke menthol, about half said they would quit smoking if menthol cigarettes were no longer sold in the United States. So what we find out is a lot of smokers say, if I didn't have easy access to it, I would less likely smoke. And so a lot of our policies are centered around that, access to these products. And that is it for me. If there's any questions.
Great presentation. Let me add that among the national organizations that were in relationships with the tobacco industry, you have to include the organization that I belong to, and that is the NNPA, National Newspaper Publishers Association, the Black Press of America. And I can tell you that for years and years and years, the tobacco industry itself was a mainstay of Black newspapers running full-page color ads in a number of markets, the same kind of ads you saw on billboards and on outdoor, particularly in the Black community. And the argument was this: the argument was that as often as not, the revenue that came from the tobacco industry meant being in business or not being in business. And if you didn't have the resources that that industry aggressively and gladly provided, we would basically cripple and in some cases eliminate our community's capacity to speak to itself. The same companies that papers that had tobacco advertising also had advertising for Black churches and Black community organizations and Black education. So it was a double-edged sword there. And I raised it to say that a principle here is still true. I have maintained that those who are advocates for the abolition of tobacco, the cessation of menthol and beyond, ought to be figuring out how we bring resources to the information infrastructure that serves our community. So as opposed to saying, we are going to penalize these institutions for their relationships with tobacco for receiving the support. And I think it's our right to do that. And I'm not disagreeing with strategies to press at every pressure point. So that's not my point. But I'm thinking that what also ought to have happened and ought to happen in the future is that we find ways to bring resources to elevate the message of the clarity of the knowledge we have now that we didn't have, and the clarity of the pernicious intent of the industry in dumping these carcinogens in our community and in our bodies. And so the criticism I'm making here, and it's a positive criticism, is how do we bring resources that are equal to or greater than the resources brought by how do we match what the industry is doing with a message that is opposite and in a way that enables and nurtures the growth of our information infrastructure. My last comment is that I've said this often, too often, we get the misery and they get the money. And what I mean by that is that Black people have misery all day and all night and the next day. And as often as not, white people benefit from admiring the problem. Oh, this is a lovely problem to admire. But then the powers that be have not made the investment in enabling and empowering great organizations like North Point and like the Black Church to be as aggressive as they possibly can in educating organizations like Insight News and Spokesman Recorder KMLJ. So that's my point. That's my message. I want to thank Latricia. I know that we were in a kerfuffle years back because Insight did accept some advertising from the tobacco industry raising the questions that you raised. And I can tell you that they approached us saying, we're not telling your community to do this. We're saying there's some rights issues here. So they came at it sideways, right? In a way of freedom of speech, but the intent and the objective was the same. And that is to make sure that their product stayed in front of people. And that, I say, is something that Latricia rightfully and properly fought and resisted and challenged. And I think that challenge continues and should continue. So Latricia, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And yours too. You've always made complete sense to me. Invest in this community in the same way that the tobacco industry historically has. We have certain media outlets that we use, and we should, along with the funding that we receive, we should fund that. We should make sure that our businesses are kept afloat as we do this work. I've always respected that opinion and always advocated for that in my work as well. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or comments? Andrew, go ahead. Unmute. Yeah.
Thank you all, and thank you both for that presentation. I have two comments. One, we talked about advertising, and in particular celebrities or influencers in advertising. I think I saw one ad that had Post Malone on it. Is there research to show if you bring a celebrity in saying don't do this, that has the same effect as if they say do, right? And I grew up in the DARE era where it was almost more of a joke than it was actually influential. So I'm curious if anything like that's changed about influencing our youth away from cigarettes or e-cigarettes, et cetera. My other question, the last slide or one of the last slides talked about, if menthol or vaping was not allowed. I can't remember if it was just menthol, if it was vaping. If it was illegal, would you stop smoking altogether? And a group of people said yes. And one thing that this coalition knows all too well is it's not necessarily you can take the abuse of substance away, but that doesn't mean you're healing that person of whatever is causing them to use that substance in the first place. So would they then, did the survey then ask, would you move on to something else to fill that need? Or would they just say, I would stop using substances altogether? So I'm just looking for some clarification on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say that thank you for those two great questions. Definitely, the survey didn't push forward to say we use something else. I think what we focused on with survey is the financial ties to tobacco. The price of cigarettes are extremely high, and the people we surveyed are people who said, I don't really have money to afford fruit and vegetables. So it was more guided towards, if you had this extra money, what would you do with it versus like, would you give up one addiction for another addiction? It was really about fiscal responsibility. My work has always been, if you live on a fixed income and you spend $200 a week on cigarettes, like how can you afford anything else? And that's where our survey and our education has always gone to, like the amount of money families would have to do other things with if the addiction wasn't there, if they didn't give up cigarettes. So no, not like would you go to a different substance, but more about like, what would you do if you had this $400 a month you spend on tobacco products? I just talked to someone a couple of weeks ago who said now that cigarettes are $11 a pack. And this is someone who lives in low income housing here in the city and has very fixed income, and their cigarette budget exceeds the money they even, that they get in. They don't even have enough money for their cigarette habit. So they've been cutting back, and now they're in a place where they just want to quit altogether because they see like that this is a financial burden. So just to clarify, the questions never go from one addiction to another, but more about like financially, how can you better use this money and those resources in your family or with yourself. And people love the idea of having more money to spend on other things than tobacco. That's the motivator. And just the basic question of if I can't walk outside to my corner store and get it, then I probably won't have it, because if transportation is a barrier, no one's driving to the city next door if they don't have transportation to go and get them. So that's usually how it goes. And then your first question was about influencers on both sides. So we've done stuff where we've used, local influencers for prevention and education. I'm not aware of like national ones anymore, where they're like these huge national, and it's like I grew up with the Target Market. That was a huge deal when I was in high school. We had like celebrities that were a part of that, and we had these big conventions down at the Target Center. But there are really big efforts around that because people use social media. So it's just like anti-tobacco ads that run, not necessarily with influencers, but like we had the slides you saw is a campaign that we started here in the Twin Cities, The Beautiful Lie, Ugly Truth. And we use local people. We use faces of people from churches in the neighborhood. We had local beauty queens and, influencers right here in North Minneapolis and St. Paul in that campaign.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answers. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Diana, go ahead.
I want to go back to the celebrities, because to me, it seems like the kids would be confused. You're using celebrities for both aspects to say, on one hand, yes, it's okay to smoke. And then on the other hand, no, it's not okay. How does a child, you really perceive that? Because I'm looking at J-Lo telling me I could smoke, but then I'm looking at Beyonce saying no. You know what I mean? How does that work in the child's mind? That's very confusing to them.
I'm sure it is. I mean, and we don't know that, like we try to provide as much prevention and education as we can, whether it's through school, through, whatever outlets young people use. And we would hope that J-Lo would be less of an influence than Beyonce.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
I mean, like that, like we have sports figures that sometimes like Joe Mauer was a huge support in the anti-tobacco work and would do things at the Twin Stadium. So, so you really do have some celebrities that just want to be a part of the work because they got influenced as a child to smoke. Mm-hmm. So they step up and just want to do the work just because. So we just hope whoever we use, Miss Diana, work, and that the J-Los of the world don't work, but they do. And like even now, Big Tobacco has some big names of some of the rappers that kids. I mean, at one time it was Nicki Minaj and The Baby, and some super influential rappers that they're paying and using for vape products and Swisher Sweets and those things. And it just makes our work a lot harder.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? So let me throw it out. Where do we go from here, Latricia and Bethlehem? What are the immediate strategies to continue the work? And how do you want neighborhood organizations, how can the coalition and its partners support the work of creating both awareness and prevention? What can we do? Latricia first, and then Bethlehem.
Yeah, so this is one of the best things you can do. It's, give us a platform to talk about the work that we're doing. This is always necessary. The prevention and education part starts with neighborhood organization, churches, the community itself. So this is the best platform that Bethlehem and I can have to talk about our work. We are still working on this at a state level. Minneapolis had, it's not a ban, it's the restriction of the sale of flavored tobacco. So you can't go into a corner store and buy these products, but you can go into a liquor store or if there's a tobacco shop. So we see now the gas station on Glendale and Broadway has shifted to this model of the corner store is the front and then the side is a tobacco shop. So they did that after the ordinance passed. They created like the shop within a shop so that they now can sell tobacco from a different side of the store. And we'll probably see a few more of those go up in North Minneapolis. So our work continues. As quick as we got that passed, the tobacco industry and store owners came right behind us and did something new to get those products right back in the store. So the more opportunities we have to provide education and prevention resources to the community, we will continue to come up with policy ideas that change the number of people who die from tobacco. I say to people all the time, if we laid out the bodies in front of the house of people who died from tobacco-related deaths, it would be just as shocking to you as gun violence.
Probably, Latricia,
More.
if you laid out the number of people in your family that died from tobacco, you'd be shocked as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Bethlehem, go ahead and talk about the same question. Where do we go from here? What is it that the community can do? What do you want the community to do to support this critical and important work?
Yeah, I think I would just echo everything Latricia said, just having the platform to kind of, meet with community members and educate them on the harms of tobacco use. And then another really important thing is just like our local work really drives the state work that we do. So having more like cities and counties supporting our work, passing policies that restrict menthol use, or not menthol use, but that restrict the sales of menthol and other flavored tobacco products really helps drive that policy work at the state level. But yeah, just education, prevention, and yeah, I think Latricia, you did a really good job. So you covered most of it there.
I think
Bill had his hand up.
Bill Magnus has a question. Yeah.
Yeah, Latricia and I'm sorry if I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, Bethlehem. I have a concern and a question, I guess. So piggybacking off of what you said, here what I've saw at the 4th precinct with working with the problem properties and getting complaints. So I actually went and did a security assessment for that tobacco shop at the Winter gas station, and I've been inside there, and they have basically one counter that just sells strictly cigarettes, and the rest of it is vapings and bongs and other materials for smoking weed and other drug paraphernalia too. So I was very disgusted with that aspect of their marketing technique. And then also what I've come to realize, and it's just a question of, do you think that maybe the city needs more strict enforcement with this? Because this last year alone, I was with our problem properties officer and our business licensing people going in, and 3 convenience stores, on the north side were caught with, after receiving complaints, were caught with menthol cigarettes, still trying to sell them. And the ordinance reads that you were given a 15-day or a warning the first time, and the second offense, you were supposed to be shut down, I believe, for 15 days. And so we went to do that after their second offense to shut them down. And then the attorneys got involved and the city backed off on enforcing that, and then just said, well, you can't sell tobacco products for 15 days. Do you think it would have helped if we had more stricter enforcement where we shut those convenience stores down, is my question.
Absolutely. Enforcement is the way. Like, that's the only way these policies stick. If people understand that there's consequences if you don't follow the policies and ordinance that's been put in place. Like I said, that shop wasn't that way before this passed. They had, they were given the okay to create that tobacco shop within the corner store. And they did that so that they could sell products. There's other stores. I've had a corner store owner tell me that, they still all sell cigarettes in their shops, and they're not worried about any type of, through COVID, they're not worried about city employees coming in and doing compliance checks or dinging them for continuing to sell the product.
No, and that was my concern, my frustration is that we went in there, we actually caught them red-handed with menthol cigarettes in their inventory, selling them on twice. You know, they were warning twice, and then the city backed off its enforcement to shut the store down and said you can't sell tobacco. Well, I think we all know as well as anybody else that they still continue to sell tobacco no matter what.
Absolutely.
So I think the city does need to take more stricter enforcement with enforcing this ordinance. Because why have the ordinance in place, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, exactly. And our coalition bill usually pushes a little harder, but in COVID times, it's been a huge disconnect from the city and the compliance checks because we don't meet regularly or we're not going in. So I usually do compliance checks with young people that are not with police, but then the health departments go in and do them with police. And we haven't done ours. And so we usually just do ours and then we give them a warning. Say you failed, warning. And then the police go in afterwards and do them with young people. And that's when they really get in trouble. We haven't had the opportunity to do that during COVID times. And we know that the city's not enforcing in the way that we talked about it being enforced, and the number of compliance checks that should be happening, especially after you fail, you get another compliance check soon after. And so we know that it's not happening and it's not being pushed. And at some point, we understand that we will have to push for that.
Well, thank you.
Brings up an
I agree with you 100%, and I appreciate that.
Thank you for that.
Well, Bill and Tricia, though, the point being brought up is very interesting. Right now in Minneapolis, the big question is what size police department and what role the police department should be playing. The difference between law enforcement and public safety, between maintaining the peace and apprehending, violators, and which violators should be apprehended. Should we spend those limited resources under resourced police departments checking on low-level offenses, or should we reserve that muscle, if you will, for things that are dangerous, that are required, to keep the public as safe as possible? So that's a big question. And if that question's on the table, then what do we do? Do we want officers' time spent managing, monitoring tobacco sales? Or is there something else some other approach we should be taking so that we optimize, right, the police services role that they have and not have them detract from that mission? Or are all these things sort of equal? What do you think, Latrice?
So as long as compliance checks is a function that is in the police department, I think it should happen by police. If we want to change that and put that under a different department, which there is city staff outside of police that go in and do the compliance checks, but sometimes they feel unsafe when they go in there and, they could be easily confronted when they find out that someone is illegally selling the product. And that's what our police are for. So I guess the answer to that would be, if we're going to use someone outside of police to go in and enforce it, then we should have a solid plan that the community is aware of, that is going to be put in place for that to happen, and not just make the decision that police shouldn't be doing that anymore. I can tell you, I've done compliance checks, and the reason why they haven't got hostile is because I didn't have a police presence. But I have experience with people who have went in and it got hostile, and they needed a police officer to come in and back them up right away. So it's with compliance checks for anything, rather it's liquor sales, whatever. I think we need to have a solid plan in place before we say, let's eliminate that as a police function, or let's, call in certain inspectors to do it. People have to feel comfortable in enforcement. There's simple enforcement, like somebody smoking next to you at a ball game and you say, hey, can you put that out? Some people feel comfortable doing it, and some people will just inhale the cigarettes because they don't want to say it. And so that's a function that we have to make sure that people are comfortable with doing before we change that.
Got it. Okay.
I like to piggyback off of that. So I wasn't involved in the compliance checks, but we do have business license that goes in if there's a violation, and there's one officer and then myself. So it's just the resources. We're just using one officer, and that's a properties officer that we no longer have anymore because he got promoted. But it's not that we're taking police away from doing calls or anything like that, because his responsibility was to go in with business licensing and then enforce the compliance checks. And that's what we were doing last year. And at one point in one of the convenience stores we went into, there was a gun in the back room back there that was, loose and loaded. And, those are one of the things that you run into. So it's actually good to have a little bit, in my opinion, of police presence when you're doing that, because if you're not there and there's a gun there, that person is armed and, you're not. So we're not doing the compliance checks. I mean, there is a entity with business licensing where they have a police officer that goes out with them just for the people who are doing the compliance checks, like Latricia was talking about, as a more of a protection mechanism. But it's not taking an exorbitant amount of resources that we use to do that.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, this has been a great conversation. Dinah, let me sort of throw it your way for a second to do a wrap up or other comments on today's meeting.
I'm going to ask Clarence, not Clarence, but Andrew, if he can talk about a little bit of announcements. But before that happened, I wanted to ask Dee and Jason if they had anything to say to add today. And Miss Brenda too. I seen you sneak in here. I think somebody's trying to unmute. Jason.
Oh, hi there. Yeah, I'm here in place of Suzanne today. Very interesting. I'm taking some notes, and if anyone has anything that they want me to forward on question-wise, otherwise, happy to do so. But very informative, very interesting today. So thank you for having me.
Jason, can you just let everybody know where you're from? We know Suzanne, but everybody don't.
Oh yeah, Minneapolis Health Department. And I just started in April. So it's been interesting.
Thank you, Jason. Dee, you have anything? She's muted again.
No, I don't have a lot to say. I guess I go back to what Bill said about, if we have the laws on the books, shouldn't they be enforced? That's what they're there for, I think. And then also, what is the coalition between these low-level offenses and other more serious offenses? I mean, is there a coordination or does one lead to the other, or does ignoring one lead to the other? I mean, how do we justify how we handle these things in order to keep the city safe and keep people safe in their homes and on the streets?
And Dee, the way I hear your question is this, tell me if I'm wrong. I hear you saying, from the vendor point of view, if we walk away from the expectation and the rules that keep you from selling illegal products, illegal cigarettes, then are you inclined or encouraged or tempted to sell other illegal activities and therefore become a greater menace to the community and to your customers? And there's also the consumer side of that, but that makes sense as a yeah. What do you guys think, Bill and is Latricia still here? Yeah, Latricia and Bethlehem.
Well, I've heard in Inspector Adams say this, and I tend to agree to it before. It seems like, and other people have said it too, it seems like last year when the city council got up there in Powderhorn Park and said what they said, it kind of opened Pandora's box. And I think that not just that a contributing factor, but it was a contributing factor among other things. And I've seen it before across the city, and not just with the police department, with other city enterprises and other agencies where the enforcement has tapered off. And I think it is I think what we see because of that is that if we're not enforcing the low level stuff, then they're not going to enforce anything else, right? I mean, And it's also been, you know, it's not just us, it's also been the Hennepin County judges and Hennepin County courts where we're arresting people for stealing cars, and they're out the next day and there's multiple cars they've stolen. I mean, there's one individual in particular this past summer that has been arrested 9 times for stealing cars, and there's no consequence for it. You know, so if there's not going to be a consequence or accountability, what's to prevent them from escalating or doing anything else? And I think that speaks to across the board what we're seeing in this uptick in violent crime as well. I mean, and I could be wrong. I don't want to try to offend anybody. It's just what I believe and what I've heard other people say too.
Thank you, Bill. Any other questions or comments? Listen, with that, we've had a great and productive meeting. And if there are no other announcements, Andrew, any announcements?
Yep. So a couple of things on September 24th, which is a Friday, Hawthorne's annual meeting will be taking place. So if anyone is a resident of Hawthorne or meets the requirements to be on the board and is interested in joining the board, please get in touch with me. More information will go out as we get closer and closer, but really we're looking for great, exciting community members who are interested in making a change and continuing all the progress the current board has done. And then winter warmth is slowly coming up, but faster than you probably want to believe. And that'll be November 20th, correct?
Correct.
Yep. And so we'll be taking donations for that soon. So just keep that in mind as well. We will not be at Farview Park. We'll be doing the same thing as we did last year. We'll be handing out in front of our office just because we haven't kicked this pandemic yet. So we want to keep people safe. Anything else I'm missing, Diana? Or
Nope, you're good. I just want to
All
say,
right.
always, Al, thank you. And for those who have nothing to do at 1 o'clock, this was a great show, and it's a great way to lead because Mr. L is going to be on talking about health at 1 o'clock. Am I correct?
That's
And
right.
it's always a great show. I learn something every Friday about my body, you guys. So tune in.
Okay, well, with that, we'll thank everybody and we'll call the meeting adjourned and we'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.